Let's be honest, the X-Men are overrated, and these ancient mutants we're about to discuss are the rightful inheritors of Earth. I said it, and yeah, it's going to make a lot of X-Men fans angry. But before you start crafting that angry tweet, stick around, because today we're diving deep into the past, exploring the origins of mutant kind, and uncovering a threat that makes Magneto look like a schoolyard bully. We're talking about the ancient mutants, beings of immense power, with history stretching back millennia. These aren't your run-of-the-mill villains. These are immortal powerhouses who've shaped the course of history from the shadows, and they each, in their own way, possess the potential to utterly destroy the X-Men. So buckle up, true believers, as we count down the top 10 ancient mutants who could wipe the X-Men off the map, ranked from youngest to oldest. Let the controversy begin. Kicking off our list at number 10 is Anathna-Mut, better known as the Sphinx. Now, when we say this guy's ancient, we mean ancient. We're talking older than your grandma's fruitcake, older than dirt, older than, well, you get the idea. He's been around for at least 3,000 years, which means he probably has strong opinions on what real papyrus feels like and thinks hieroglyphic is the superior form of writing, the kids and their cuneiform. Am I right? This guy's got more ties to ancient Egypt than a mummy's linen closet. I wouldn't be surprised if he helped build the pyramids. Probably got workers' comp for a bad back, too. Probably filed a complaint with the foreman. These stones are not ergonomically sound. You know he did, but don't let the age fool you. The Sphinx isn't just some dusty relic collecting cobwebs in a museum. Thanks to the mystical Ka stone, a cosmic artifact that's probably older than he is, this guy's packing some serious power. We're talking superhuman strength that could probably win him a gold medal in the tossing obelisks event at the Olympics, if they had that back then, which, knowing him, he probably started. He can also manipulate energy, which means he can blast you with the force of 1,000 suns, or, you know, just heat up his coffee without a microwave. Convenience is key when you're immortal. He's basically a walking, talking, energy-blasting history lesson. You want to know about ancient Egyptian burial rituals? Ask the Sphinx. Need help translating hieroglyphics? Sphinx is your guy. Want to know if aliens really built the pyramids? He'll probably just wink and say maybe, because he's seen some stuff, man, stuff you wouldn't believe. Now, the Sphinx has had his share of run-ins with the superhero crowd, most notably the Fantastic Four and Nova. These aren't exactly small-timers, which means the Sphinx can clearly hold his own in a super-powered brawl. He's like the grumpy old man of the Marvel Universe, yelling at those darn kids to get off his lawn, except his lawn is a 3,000-year-old temple, and he yells with the force of a supernova. Sure, he hasn't been a regular thorn in the X-Men side, but let's be honest, with his kind of power and lifespan, he's like that weird uncle at the family reunion who might accidentally set the house on fire while trying to show off his magic tricks. You just don't know what he's capable of, and that's what makes him dangerous. He's a total wild card, a living, breathing what-if scenario waiting to happen. The X-Men might not be on his radar yet, but if he ever decided to take a break from reminiscing about the good old days of pharaohs and plagues, they'd have a serious problem on their hands. He's got the power, the experience, and the potential to be a major headache for anyone, even a team of highly trained mutants. He is not to be trifled with. Sliding into number 9 is Genesis, Apocalypse's ex-wife. Talk about a messy divorce. This lady's been around for 4,000 to 5,000 years, probably spent most of it arguing with Apocalypse over who gets custody of the celestial technology. She rules the ancient mutant island of Araco, which is like the Bermuda Triangle, but with more angst and plant manipulation. Genesis is an Omega-level mutant who can control plant life. She's basically Poison Ivy's great, you get the idea, grandmother, but with a much bigger grudge. If she ever decided to swap her island paradise for world domination, the X-Men would be facing a whole lot of angry trees. And trust me, you haven't lived until you've been smacked by a sentient redwood. Number 8 brings us the enigmatic Forever Man, who's less of a man and more of a, well, a series of men. This guy's like a human version of a save game file, constantly being reborn with all his old memories. He's been kicking around for at least 5,000 years, which means he's probably seen every fashion trend come and go, and come back again. Forever Man's not the strongest mutant, but he's got more knowledge and experience than Wikipedia and a library had a baby. He's like that one guy at the party who's seen it all, done it all, and has a story for everything. The X-Men would be wise not to underestimate him unless they want a lecture on the proper way to churn butter or the best places to avoid the plague. Coming in at number 7 is Exodus, a mutant crusader from the 12th century. This guy probably still thinks doth is a perfectly acceptable verb. Transformed by Apocalypse, Exodus became a true believer in mutant superiority, like Magneto, but with a serious case of Messiah complex. Exodus is packing some serious heat, telepathy, telekinesis, teleportation, the whole psychic enchilada, and his powers are juiced up by his unwavering faith, which is basically like giving a toddler a double espresso and a megaphone. He's a danger to anyone who doesn't subscribe to his Mutants Are the Best newsletter, and that definitely includes the X-Men. At number 6, we have Azazel, Nightcrawler's deadbeat dad. This guy's a real piece of work. He's an ancient extra-dimensional mutant with ties to biblical demons, which probably explains why he's not winning any Father of the Year awards. He probably skips out on child support too. Azazel can teleport, induce fear, and probably knows all the best places to get cheap drinks in the underworld. He's basically a chaotic, teleporting nightmare, and his presence is a guaranteed headache for the X-Men. Plus, family drama? No thanks. Number 5 brings us Saul, an external, which is basically the X-Men universe's version of the Highlander Club. Nobody knows exactly how old this guy is, but it's definitely in the older than dirt category. This guy probably remembers when Pangea was the hottest vacation spot. Saul's got a grab bag of powers, energy blasts, force fields, telepathy. He's like a Swiss Army knife of mutant abilities. He's also cunning and manipulative, which is a dangerous combination when you've lived for thousands of years and have probably seen every trick in the book. He's the kind of guy who would cheat at Monopoly and then claim he invented the game. He is now dead, killed by number 2 on our list. And at number 4, we have another external, Gideon. This guy's so old, he probably remembers when fire was the hot new invention. He's also a ruthless businessman, which means he's probably got offshore accounts in the time stream or something. Gideon can absorb and redirect energy, and he's got superhuman strength, durability, and speed. He's basically a walking, talking battery with a bad attitude. He's fought both with and against the X-Men, making him about as trustworthy as a used car salesman. He is also, you guessed it, dead. Taking the bronze medal at number 3 is Iska the Unbeaten. Her power? She can't lose. Seriously. It's like she has a cheat code for life. She's been around for about 10,000 years, probably winning every game of rock, paper, scissors along the way. Now, she's been an X-Men ally, but let's be real, that's probably just because they're the winning team right now. If the X-Men ever start losing, Iska would probably switch sides faster than you can say mutant registration. Facing her is basically like playing a game where the other person has already declared themselves the winner. Where's the fun in that? At number 2, we have Selene, the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club, and the reason why the term cougar was probably invented. This lady's been around for a whopping 17,000 years, and she's not afraid to use her, shall we say, experience to get what she wants. Selene's a psychic vampire who can drain your life force faster than you can say bad decision. She's also a powerful sorceress, which basically makes her the ultimate evil goth girl. In the Necrosha storyline, she resurrected millions of dead mutants because apparently she was bored and needed a hobby. She's ruthless, cunning, and probably has a killer skincare routine. You don't live for 17,000 years without picking up a few beauty secrets, and she did kill numbers 4 and 5 on this very list. And finally, the big cheese, the head honcho, the ancient mutant who takes the number 1 spot, Apocalypse. This guy's so old, he probably remembers when the Dead Sea was just the slightly unwell sea. He's been around for 5,000, 6,000 years, give or take, and he spent most of that time trying to make survival of the fittest the official motto of Earth. Apocalypse has more powers than a Swiss Army knife factory. He can shapeshift, teleport, shoot energy blasts, control minds. Basically anything you can think of, he can probably do it. And he's immortal, thanks to his fancy Lazarus chamber, which is like a cosmic reset button. The Age of Apocalypse storyline showed us what happens when this guy wins, and let's just say, it's not pretty. He's the ultimate threat to the X-Men, the final boss they might never be able to defeat.
Some mutants are simply better suited to acting as a hero for all than others. I mean, if you know Axel Clooney, I think you know why I included him here on this list. Zeitgeist is most often associated with ecstatics. His power is that he can vomit up acid. Ew. He learned he was a mutant with powers in one of the worst possible ways during a makeout session as a teenager. Yeah. The girl he was with at the time survived, but he's never been able to remember her name, and as such, her presence haunts him. He's always wondered if remembering her name would help him to be less tormented by this moment from his past. Zeitgeist is not only weird, but I don't think he has the right attitude for the X-Men either. Sorry, Zeitgeist. Next up, Maggie is another mutant who is just straight up weird looking. In fact, when Alex Ross helped to create her along with Kurt Busiek, he helped to make her look even more strange than she was initially intended to be. Maggie was originally going to be a boy, a little green boy specifically, but Ross wanted her look to contrast even more with Angel, who appears on the cover of this issue with her, flying with his angel wings out while he carries Maggie in his arm. Maggie makes her first appearance in Marvel's issue number 2. She was born with her mutation and because of this was abandoned. She has such a sad story in comics, and while I don't think we'd ever see her on the X-Men, also because, you know, she's a little kid and they don't normally have little kids on the team. Teens maybe, but usually not like infants. I would love to see her appear more alongside them, just because she has such a unique look and sad origin, and I'd love to see her grow up and like find happiness. Like, she doesn't have to be on the X-Men team, but I don't know, just be cool to see her like being mentored by the X-Men. This next one, Callisto, is too much of a rebel for the X-Men, but she also, for a while there, had tentacle arms, which is why I've included her here. She doesn't have them anymore, to be fair, but I thought that might be an interesting sight to see her recruited in the past, back when she did have her tentacle arms. Her tentacles, however, were not part of her mutation, but instead were given to her by the other mutant warlock, Mask, who can use his powers to change a person's form. Mask did this to torment Callisto, something he's done multiple times throughout her past, both by making her beautiful and by making her less than. And if you're wondering how do you torment someone by making them beautiful, it's because she's usually scarred, and he's like, no, you don't have a scar, and like, ha ha ha. Although really, I was thinking, I was like, I feel like Callisto's like, yeah, okay, good prank, I'm gonna go be beautiful, I guess. Alex doesn't have a fancy code name like Maggie either. He is one of the babies we saw in Inferno, the original Inferno, not the new one. His mutant power looks like it's similar to Glob Herman's. Honestly, I love Glob, although it sounds a little bit more useful than Glob's. But while Glob is a bizarre mutant who is well loved, Alex is tragically mostly unknown. I bet you didn't know about him before this list. Ergo, he is both weird and not someone I would imagine being on the X-Men. Alex has a goo body, which he can control, which basically makes him like a living, walking, gelatinous cube from Dungeons & Dragons. Except I don't think he disintegrates those he takes inside his form. Instead, he can only suffocate them, or he can simply engulf them to like just move them somewhere else, immobilizing them for a time. This next one, Cell, is a weird one, which I guess fitting on this list where we got a bunch of weirdos. He kind of reminds me of Maggot, honestly, but if Maggot didn't like have his maggots, his body can fuse the cells of his entire form so that they become one singular cell. This allows him to absorb damage without being hurt, basically reinforcing his form. He can also turn into a liquid-like state as well, and he can also emit ooze that is basically like acid, allowing him to burn those he comes into contact with, digesting them in essence from the outside. He was part of a group of Chicago mutant warlocks and appeared in the miniseries by Jeff Johns and Sean Martinborough titled simply Morlocks. If you know me and what I usually like to talk about on this channel, then you know I'm a pretty big Peeper fan. Peeper is Peter Quinn. My first ever experience reading about him was during Messiah Complex, and from that moment on, I became a fan of his. This might seem odd to you if you read Messiah Complex. Now this might seem odd to you considering that in that story, he calls X-Factor to report that he's basically being followed, and he's soon after attacked and killed by Predator X. When Siren later arrives on the scene, it is implied that it is a very gruesome one. But I just tend to gravitate towards the mutants who feel very much like everyday characters. Also, if you're worried about Peeper, don't be worried because he later on just shows up and he's like totally fine. I don't think we've ever gotten an explanation for that, but somehow he's fine. I know it seems like he died horribly, but he apparently didn't. He just shows up later and it's never explained, in case you were wondering. So he's good. But I just tend to gravitate towards the mutants who feel like very everyday characters, I guess. They might not be the ones in the main books, but for some reason, that's what I like about them. Maybe it's because it makes them feel more grounded in reality or more relatable. After all, none of us on this planet are superheroes, and while some people might have abilities that make them seem that way, or might be heroes of a kind, superhero is not something that usually intersects. Characters like Peeper make me feel more seen in a comic. Like Peeper, I too had my own villain era, but am always striving now to be more of a hero in my own way every day. Peeper's powers aren't anything crazy. He has basically superhuman vision, which allows him to see further away, and which also allows him to see like closer up than normal human eyes can see. And while I feel some folks may have forgotten this one in recent years, he can also fire optic blasts. And mostly his eyes just kind of bulge out of his head. His optic blasts, though, I think are lesser strength and like lesser skill set than Cyclops. I feel bad for this next one. We're talking about Amber. She got one pretty cool story where she is clearly established as a college kid who just wants to live her life, and despite being immune, doesn't really let this define who she is or what she's capable of. And then, right after, we think, wow, that's cool. Amber could be a really cool character to follow along, just even in a slice of life story, or especially if she was pulled into becoming a mutant hero. But no, she gets depowered during M-Day. Or at least that's what I believed happened. I'm not sure if it was ever specified. A lot of people were depowered during M-Day, and she's one of the people that we believe was depowered. I don't think she's ever specifically seen after her adventure with Jono during her appearance in his Chamber series. It was a mini-series, only a few issues. Amber was definitely weird to behold because her default physical mutation made her green and covered in spikes. But she was actually a shapeshifter who typically shapeshifted into a beautiful woman in her dreams. But she also could control this ability and just shapeshift, I think, pretty normally. I think she just mainly preferred to just appear as she was, which honestly, super cool. Kinda like Mystique, but what if Mystique wasn't a baddie and just wanted to chill and go to college? Which I kind of love as a story. While a student at the Xavier Institute, I don't believe this next mutant, Slick, ever made the main X-Men team, nor has he been featured on any spin-off mutant team either. Slick's powers were charisma-based. He basically exuded charisma and made himself likable. He could also cast illusions, as we'd later learn when he and Quentin Quire's Kid Omega butted heads. The two didn't get along, and of course at one point, Quire used his powers to dispel the illusions that Slick was constantly casting. Now these illusions made him appear as a handsome young man, but this was not actually his true appearance, as it turned out. He also had a physical mutation and appeared as a small, web-footed creature with pointed ears. Kind of impish looking, if you want to imagine that, but I'm sure we're showing you a picture right now. After having his true appearance revealed at the moment when he was working on a song with his girlfriend Tattoo, she broke up with him. Maybe not because of his appearance, maybe more because she was like, you didn't even tell me this. I didn't even know this is what you looked like. Slither isn't just a weird character, he's also a bad guy, which is why he would probably never join the X-Men. But if he was a hero, I'd be surprised to see him on the main team. For the most part, I'd say that mutants on the main X-Men roster tend to be pretty normal looking. In fact, many of them are also very pretty looking. I think for the most part, this is because the X-Men are meant to be a premier superhero team, serving not just the mutant community, but also the world at large. We don't usually see people with significant physical mutations on there. I mean, Beast is big and blue, but he's also often likened to a giant teddy bear. And even with mainstay Beast, he started out looking just like a normal person pretty much, save for his oversized feet and hands before he went through his secondary mutation. Slither also literally looks like a snake, which I'm sure would make having to save people who are afraid of snakes, a pretty common fear amongst many people, a lot more challenging. And finally, Cool Million. 1, Cool Million is a villain. 2, he is the most 90s I've seen in terms of his character design. And 3, his name is Cool Million. So yeah, I don't think he'll ever be making the cut for the X-Men, ever. Cool Million operated as a mercenary in the comics and at one point was hired to work for Hydra. His mutant power was apparently psionic and that of persuasion, but he could only persuade people while maintaining eye contact with them. However, I don't know, it could have been lasting. I'm you do this and then you go off and do it. But I like to imagine that you have to maintain eye contact the entire time because that's funnier. To really understand this team, we have to go all the way back to their humble beginnings over at Marvel Comics. The team supposedly came to be thanks to a group you're quite familiar with. No, I'm not talking about Marvel, and no, I'm not talking about legendary duo Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I'm talking about us, the fans. Well, I mean, not me specifically, as I was not alive back in 1963, but the fans who were around back then and reading comics had a need for more Marvel team books. There were many solo hero books out there, but fans wanted to see more team-ups, and so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with the X-Men. Stan Lee had said before that the challenge with team books where new characters were introduced was explaining how they all got their powers, their origins. To simplify this, he had an idea of making the entire team a group of mutants, using that same blanketed reason to explain how they each got their powers. Pretty easy, you can just say, hey, they're mutants. The brilliance of this is that while on paper this sounds like an easy, even lazier approach to some, it actually worked. A huge part of the reason why the X-Men were so successful and why we love them even today is because of their mutant status. Initially, Stan wanted to give them a simple name, denoting this status, the Mutants. But publisher Martin Goodman turned down the name idea, citing the fact that no one knew what a mutant was. Some even believed that the name, the Mutants, could still be used as a good alternative name for the group when they debut in the MCU, but we'll have to wait to find out about that. Instead, Lee decided to take inspiration for the team's name from their leader and mentor, Professor X, calling them simply the X-Men. In those early comics created by Kirby and Lee, Professor Charles Xavier, or Professor X, as he'd come to be more commonly known, created a school for young mutants, guided by a dream of peaceful coexistence with humankind. You see, the public was not a fan of mutants, and there were many evil mutants out there that gave mutant kind a bad rap. To combat this, Professor X decided to create a school for gifted youngsters in Westchester County, New York, bringing together a team of young mutants using his telepathic abilities and Cerebro, which we later learned was actually created by X and his future student Jean Grey. The initial team and group of students that started it all were Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and of course, Jean Grey as Marvel Girl. During these early days, they were also sometimes joined by Mimic, who initially was introduced as a deadly villain that could adopt the abilities and powers of those around him, making him a formidable foe for the X-Men, as he could, mimic all of their powers. However, Mimic would soon after be reformed, and after losing and regaining his powers kind of multiple times, would also end up adopting the OG X-Men roster's power sets permanently. These were the early days of the X-Men, which also introduced one of their greatest enemies, who coincidentally would also throughout the years become somewhat reformed before becoming a full-on anti-hero, or even to some, a full-on hero in modern day comics, Magneto, the master of magnetism, and his also quite infamous Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who themselves would have many various different versions and rosters throughout the years. Eventually, the X-Men series was taken over by Roy Thomas, beginning with issue number 20. Throughout the continuation of the series, other writers would also help out, and we'd see characters like Havoc, Cyclops' heroically reluctant brother, who was also a mutant, and Polaris, who we later learned was the daughter of Magneto, having powers similar to him, introduced. This series would be ongoing until issue number 66, where it would come to a firm stop as sales dwindled somewhat. Up until issue 93 of the series, the X-Men title would only exist to sell reprints of older stories. So there's a period there where nothing new is really happening, it's just a lot of reprints. However, with Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, we'd see X-Men return in a big way, finally getting a new tale and ultimately a revival. Len Wein and Dave Cockrum were the creatives behind this first Giant Size, which would become a Marvel and X-Men staple. In fact, recently in 2020, we saw a new Giant Size X-Men series emerge in this similar vein. Each issue of that series focusing on a story tied to a different X-Men. In the first ever Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, though, a whole new team of X-Men were introduced, featuring Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Thunderbird, Banshee, Nightcrawler, and Sunfire. Oh, and Cyclops was also there. Although it should be noted, as I talk about the evolution of the roster, I likely won't mention all members every single time to avoid repetition. I'm also not going to mention every single roster because I could just do that in one video and that could be a whole video. Suffice it to say, there have been a lot of X-Men rosters that Scott Summers has been a part of as well. If he's not mentioned, he might still be on there. The difference between this team and the original X-Men team was that this team was a lot more grown up. The former youngsters had all grown up, and this team reflected that, with all new members also being adults as opposed to teens. The Giant Size roster was also unique in that each team member was radically different from the other, having a completely different background, power set, and in many cases even country of origin. This was probably the first roster to really reflect another trait many fans love about the X-Men today: diversity. In terms of the why behind this team, they were brought together to rescue the original X-Men from the deadly sentient mutant island known as Krakoa, currently actually an ally to the X-Men in modern day comics, but once a villain in their history. Technically wedged in between this rescue rescue attempt, and when the X-Men ended up in peril, was another team initially led by Moira McTaggart, but outside of the canon, in real-world comic history, this team wouldn't be retconned into existence until the early 2000s. It would serve to help introduce the youngest Summers brother, the quote-unquote mystery Summers bro, Vulcan. But back to the giant-sized team. They were successful in their rescue mission, and afterwards were left to ask the question, now that all the X-Men were safe and sound, new and old, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men? Well, they wouldn't have to worry about this too much, as they weren't lucky number 13 for too long. Shortly afterwards, Sunfire left the team in a huff, Thunderbird died on a mission unfortunately, Iceman and Angel ultimately moved out of the X-Mansion, and Havoc and Polaris decided to go back to school. Jean Grey as well also left for a period, kind of returning to school, but her romantic connection to Scott Summers kept her mostly active on the team's roster. Jean would also eventually become the Phoenix, sending us down a path towards one of the most iconic X-Men stories, I would say, of all time, the Phoenix Saga, and of course the even more iconic follow-up story, the Dark Phoenix Saga. While the adult X-Men team continued on, there were newer mutants introduced, and a second X-Men title was added to make room for them and their stories. This new young team of teen mutants had a book whose title reflected just what they were, the New Mutants, in a way calling back to the simplicity of the title Stan Lee had originally thought up. This era is often considered one of the best among fans, with creative team Chris Claremont and John Byrne often standing out as the main folks we think of when we reflect back on these iconic moments and stories. In addition to the Phoenix Saga, there was also Days of Future Past and God Loves, Man Kills. Many of the stories you've seen brought to life in film and animated series adaptations are actually taken from this time period in mutant and X-Men history. Another spin-off title was added at this time to showcase the tales of the original X-Men roster, the most classic of teams. However, because we already had an X-Men team and title, this book and the team within its pages would become known instead as X-Factor. At that time, X-Factor was the old roster returning to action, not yet a mutant detective agency. Despite being what most fans associate with that name now, that version of X-Factor actually wouldn't become known to us until the early 2000s, with X-Factor Investigations making its first appearance in Madrox issue number 1 in 2004, which led into the 2005 X-Factor series, which is technically volume 3 of that series. Even more books would be added to what seemed to be developing as somewhat of an X-Men line, I would say. Excalibur appeared as part of Marvel UK's collection of comics. This comic featured 3 X-Men, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, and Rachel Summers, who teamed up on adventures with Marvel UK superheroes Brian Braddock's Captain Britain and Megan. By the time we got to the 80s, we had a completely new roster of X-Men who were featured in the Uncanny X-Men title, which actually is considered to be a renamed portion of the X-Men Legacy series. This new roster featured Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Rogue, Psylocke, Dazzler, Longshot, and Havoc, among others. Angel, Nightcrawler, Polaris, Banshee, and Kitty Pryde's Sprite were also present, as was Professor X. This era featured one of my favorite X-Men story epics, Inferno. While the 80s were a pretty magical time for X-Men stories, the party came crashing to a halt somewhat in issue number 251 of Uncanny X-Men, when the team split up! Of course, no cliffhanger here for us living in the retrospective future, as we know the X-Men would and did return. In issue number 254, a new team revealed themselves, coming together on Muir Island, nearby to Scotland. This roster was made up of both mutants and humans, featuring Banshee, Polaris, Forge, Dr. Moira McTaggart, Professor X's son, Legion, Nightcrawler's magical foster sister and also romantic love interest, Amanda Sefton, Brigadier Sandy Stewart, who belonged to the Weird Happenings organization, aka WHO, Tom Corsi, Sharon Friedlander, and very briefly, Sunder. This mutant team is often referred to as the Muir Island X-Men. We were also introduced to supporting characters like the Muir Island Morlocks, including Callisto and Healer, and the Freedom Force, which initially featured Destiny, Mystique, and Valerie Cooper, but would kind of become like an alternate Brotherhood roster, to be honest. The core X-Men team, however, would stay pretty much broken up until issue number 270, when all mutants were brought together once more in Extinction Agenda to fight against the cyborg Cameron Hodge. Possibly one of the most famed X-Men creative teams of all time, started to sort out the current state of the X-Men and their fractured rosters as we moved into the 90s. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. In issue number 273, we got a story called appropriately, Too Many Mutants. Truer words were never spoken, which aimed to rectify all the confusion by finally giving us a new X-Men roster featuring Storm, Wolverine, Psylocke, Jubilee, Gambit, Forge, and Banshee. By 1991, we saw the many mutants coming together once more to take on the evil psionic mastermind known as the Shadow King during the Muir Island saga. After that battle, however, we were once more left with the remnants of 3 teams all kind of jumbled together. The Muir Island X-Men, the X-Men X-Men, and X-Factor. Once again, at the end of X-Factor issue number 70, we were left with the question, this time asked by Professor X, what am I going to do with 14 X-Men? No one looks pleased either about this issue on the page where this question is asked, perhaps because they are all upset that Professor X has maybe forgotten them, as he seems to have miscounted, but I assume this is just supposed to be a play on the 13 and we're just one-upping it, because there's definitely people that are not included in that count, including some who are not pictured here, and Professor X himself. There were likely even more than 14 X-Men now gathered. The solution to this question finally came in the form of creating multiple actual X-Men teams. Not spin-offs, but instead 2 main rosters. This is where the much-loved original X-Men Gold and Blue rosters come in, and this love is in fact proven by sales, with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont's X-Men issue number 1 being known as the best-selling comic of all time. At the time of this recording, there have been a reported over 8 million copies sold, which is pretty wild. The blue team featured Cyclops as leader, with Gambit, Rogue, Beast, Psylocke, Wolverine, and Jubilee rounding out the team's ranks, and briefly featuring Revanche as well. The blue team featured more of the edgy and newer X-Men characters, and was written and drawn by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. Featured in the pages of the second volume of X-Men from 1991, starting of course with issue number 1, although they wouldn't actually be the blue team until like a few issues later, in terms of like them just being the mainstay. Think about issue 4. The gold team, on the other hand, featured Storm as leader, with members including Colossus, Angel's Archangel, Bishop, Jean, Forge, and Iceman. This team was depicted as the more seasoned and experienced one, showcasing more of the classic X-Men of the 60s and 70s. This team's stories were told in the pages of Uncanny X-Men, kicking off with issue number 281 of the series. I personally love this cover. The creative team involved included John Byrne, Jim Lee, and Wilchi Portacio. The costumes showcased with both teams, designed by Jim Lee, became pretty iconic and served to inspire their looks in the 90s X-Men animated series. To this day, they're still my favorite X-Men suits. The 90s was also the time that we were introduced to the mutant Black Ops team X-Force, who initially started out as kinda like time-traveling assassins made up of the former New Mutants team, who are now being led by big, gun-toting, time-traveling son of Madeline Pryor, Scott Summers, and sort of Jean Grey from the future, Cable. X-Factor would also continue as a government-funded team led by Havoc and Polaris, and despite the fact that the 2 mainstay teams were introduced to help simplify the murkiness created by having simply too many characters, the 90s is actually where it gets somehow even more confusing. Despite each team being somewhat tied to a specific X-Men title, these titles both had X-Men in the name, and often stories unfolded and were woven through multiple series, meaning you needed to collect multiple titles to get the whole story. While this can be fun at the time of collecting, it can also be exhausting, and expensive, and confusing to figure out when you're returning back to older stories. Both teams actually lived in the X-Mansion, but simply went on separate missions. Starting in 1993 with Uncanny X-Men issue 298 and X-Men issue number 17, the teams also started to swap members for certain missions, making everything even more confusing for readers to try to discern between the 2 once very distinct rosters. During this era, however, we did get many memorable and character-defining stories, including Fatal Attractions, Phalanx Covenant, and the Onslaught event. But by 1994, the terms blue and gold had kinda lost all meaning, with both teams pretty much melding together. By 1998, the roster had shrunk down to 8 core members, including Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Gambit, and Marrow, surprisingly, with stories featuring the team continuing to weave back and forth between Uncanny X-Men and the X-Men series, starting with issue number 360 and issue number 80, respectively. Since the 90s, there have been a slew of other important stories as we moved into the 2000s and beyond, including the alternate timeline Ultimate X-Men, E is for Extinction, House of M and M-Day, Messiah Complex and Messiah War, Schism, Avengers vs. X-Men, Inhumans vs. X-Men, and Resurrection. There have also been countless X-Men books featuring multiple teams, many of which simply refer to themselves as the X-Men, even when a mainstay X-Men book was also already ongoing alongside them, which means we get a lot of stories, but also making sense of the X-Men roster gets more and more confusing. These titles have included The Amazing X-Men, The Astonishing X-Men, Extreme X-Men, New X-Men, which was the main mainstay at the time, known as the Grant Morrison era of X-Men, X-Men Legacy, Young X-Men, Wolverine in the X-Men, which is actually one of my favorites, All New X-Men, which featured the time-displaced OG X-Men, X-Men Gold, Spider-Man in the X-Men, Extraordinary X-Men, the 2017 relaunch of Blue and Gold teams with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold. And then of course, there were all the books that were simply known as Uncanny X-Men and X-Men, including one volume of the series simply titled X-Men from 2015 that features an all-female roster of mutants led by Storm that I feel like no one really ever talks about for some reason. I still can't believe how seemingly quiet the hype surrounding that series was. And I know that not a lot of people were super here for it, but also, what a cool team! I suppose it all pretty much goes to show you that by the 2010s, people were pretty much overwhelmed with X-Men content, with the mutant hype receding for some time. To give you some more perspective here, despite the initial X-Men series being consistently returned to, sometimes renamed, but often maintaining or returning to actual legacy numbering, we are still also on the 6th volume of the X-Men title with the 2021 series. Pretty crazy to think, considering how long some of those other series went on for. The modern age, however, has seen a great boost to X-Men popularity, and I have to say I feel lucky to be one of the folks reading along through this entire era. In 2019, Jonathan Hickman and Pepe Larraz became the main creative team behind House of X and Powers of 10, which kicked off the era of X-Men we are in now, which I like to refer to as the Krakoan era. This has been a 3-part multi-year saga that is still ongoing, spanning a number of series in the double digits. The 3 major acts of this epic can be divided between Dawn of X, Reign of X, and Fall of X. Events have included one of my all-time favorites, Ten of Swords, the Marvel-wide crossover AXE Judgment Day or Axe, and SOS, aka Sins of Sinister, as well as recurring yearly Hellfire galas, which we can all dress up and attend in our minds. However, the X-Men history and family will continue on as the Krakoa era is soon coming to a close, with 2023's Hellfire Gala being advertised as the last. My heart.
Number 10, Forearm. This villain was a member of the Mutant Liberation Front who frequently came up against members of the New Mutants and X-Force, as well as occasionally the X-Men. Although many of the other members of this team vary from appearance to appearance, Forearm is a mainstay of the group. So, what can he do? Well, he has some increased durability, strength, and stamina, but as the name would suggest, his main ability is that he has 4 arms. He eventually left the Mutant Liberation Front once he discovered that his fellow teammate and girlfriend Moonstone was really an undercover S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. He was seen participating in the Bloodsport Championship, where he was killed by a member of the Serpent Society named Anaconda. But he later appeared alive and well with no explanation as a new member of a New Mutant Liberation team before eventually being welcomed to the New Mutant island of Koa and later joining Sword and Magic's Dark Riders.
Number 9, Mr. Sinister. It feels strange putting Mr. Sinister so low on this list, considering how truly unbelievable he is. I mean, just look at him. And then go back and look at his first appearance. Remember when Sinister had sharp teeth? That was a time. Mr. Sinister has always been an unbelievable villain, not just because of his striking and unusual appearance, but because of his obsession with the Summers family, particularly Scott, and later because of his long-standing involvement with both the Summers and the Greys, as well as an origin that attached him to them when they traveled to the past, as well as an origin that tied him to Apocalypse. And now it's gotten even more unbelievable, with Mr. Sinister not just being one, but possibly existing as 4 separate entities, each belonging to their own unique race. Like, what is even happening with this man? He's crazy. At least no matter how unbelievable he continues to get, he will always look fabulous while doing it. That is something that I think in the comics is a guarantee. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not click that subscribe button? We know a lot of you are not subscribed, and you know what? Every time you click that subscribe button, a host gets their wings. So if you click it, maybe I'll just randomly start sprouting wings. Might not be on camera, but it'll happen eventually.
Number 8, Skinless Man. One of the more visually repellent villains on this list, Skinless Man was originally Harry Pizer, a mutant during the Cold War with elastic and multisensory skin, which allowed him to be an efficient spy and member of the Weapon Plus program. They augmented his strength and made his skin more durable and elastic and gave him the name Weapon 3. He was sent to obtain a weapon called the Orb of Necromancy, but was shot and left for dead by Phantom X and captured by the Captain Britain Corps, who removed his skin. Phantom X later stole his skin to create bullets that were sentient and therefore never missed. Pizer taught his muscle to imitate the powers his skin had had, and became a villain, being recruited to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. He typically fights X-Force rather than the X-Men, but honestly, potato potato. He is pretty unbelievable just because, I mean, look at him. What the hell? He eventually died in Uncanny X-Force number 34.
Number 7, Cassandra Nova. Cassandra Nova is one of the strangest, but also maybe in a weird twist, greatest X-Men villains ever. She is the evil twin of Professor Xavier that we never knew existed originally. But really, she isn't like a straight up evil twin. She is what's known as a Mummidry, which is an evil reflection of ourselves. The alien race known as the Shi'ar believe we must fight and defeat our Mummidry in order to be born successfully into the world. Yeah, it's a pretty wild concept. And also a weird one to apply to an Earthling like Xavier or even other people on Earth, considering, you know, this is a Shi'ar belief and ultimately a kind of a Shi'ar thing. But who says that Shi'ar's beliefs can't be true for other planets or Earthlings, I guess? Especially when Xavier would grow up to have such close ties to the Empire, even at one time becoming the consort of Lilandra Naramani, the ruler and magistrix of the Shi'ar Empire. And it gets even weirder. Not only did Professor X defeat Cassandra in the womb before being born, meaning his X gene was activated in utero, but she also somehow survived this encounter, likely thanks to the strength of the man that she was a doppel of. Cassandra survived for years as basically a kind of like a puddle of goo and would eventually return. And she's still around now, having been cured of her hatred towards mutants and even teaming up with the Mutant Marauders hero team on Krakoa in the modern day, which also is super weird, but I love it.
Number 6, Mojo. So, Mojo is a member of a race called the Spineless, who can't move without the help of motorized platforms. They were all driven insane by waves of energy that turned out to be television signals. Their government is based on the structure of the television industry, and Mojo is its leader, calling the world Mojo World and their universe the Mojoverse. Everyone on Mojo World is addicted to a gladiator-like sports show, and Mojo does everything he can to keep the ratings up. Some of his more infamous plots were when he replaced Psylocke's eyes with cameras so he could broadcast everything she saw to his people, or when he transformed the X-Men into children and later cloned them and made the X-Babies, who he hoped he could control. Honestly, every sentence about this guy makes less sense than the last, and his entire deal seems to be just really broad and surface level criticism of the entertainment industry, so I'm just gonna move on now.
Number 5, Lucifer. Lucifer has always been a really weird one for me from the comics, another enemy to Professor Charles Xavier. This nemesis was originally attributed with paralyzing Charles, forcing him to be confined to a wheelchair. Initially, it was implied through mysterious illusions that Lucifer may actually be Satan himself. This was when Charles left the X-Men team in the care of Cyclops when he went on his own mission. Xavier did this following the students' graduation from his school, believing they were ready to be left on their own when it came to heroics, leaving Cyclops in charge. When Cyclops did reach out to him during his mission, Charles answered, as we saw in the comics, from a dark, kind of fiery looking cavern that he seemed to be lowering himself further into. There wasn't actual fire in these panels, I don't think, but definitely I feel like there was some red lighting happening. Also, the fact that the character's name was Lucifer, who Charles was in pursuit of. However, we later learned that Lucifer was not in fact Satan incarnate, but instead an alien trying to help his race conquer the Earth? Huh?
Number 4, Mammomax. Maximus Jensen's mutation is very off and kind of vague. He is a man who was either born or transformed into an elephant man. He has big tusks which he uses to attack his foes, has the strength of an elephant, which I guess kinda goes without saying, and has nearly invulnerable skin. Like all elephants, he has the ability to spit acid at people as well. What's that? Elephants don't do that? Well then, that's kind of a random ability for him to have, isn't it? He was a member of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, joining because he thought he'd get to hang out with tough Magneto-trained mutants. He was disappointed with the roster he got stuck with, and was presumably even more disappointed when he and the Brotherhood got stranded in Mojo World. He was eventually captured by the Facility, where he was eaten by a monster, but he was later resurrected by the Five in Krakoa. Now, I have no issue with an elephant villain, but the idea of someone being mutated to just be an elephant is pretty unbelievable. unbelievable, even for the X-Men.
Number 3. Moira McTaggart. Possibly one of the most shocking villains on our list is Moira McTaggart. Moira isn't unbelievable in the sense of being ridiculous or being weird, she is more shocking in the fact of her actual allegiances and origins, which have recently been revealed. For years, Moira has been established as a friend of the X-Men, a human ally who believes that mutants deserve equal rights. But we would later learn the truth, that Moira herself is actually a mutant. And then we'd later learn again that despite her actually also being a mutant, which you'd think would make her more allied with the X-Men, she is no longer an ally to the X-Men, but one of their #1 enemies. What? Moira would even join up with the deadly and influential organization known as Orchis, which aims to put an end to mutants in an effort to preserve and safeguard humanity. Moira herself has kind of been stripped of her mutant genes and powers and turned into a bit of a cyborg, but this hasn't stopped her from continuing in her fight against mutant kind, in a shocking comic book twist.
Number 2. Nimrod. Nimrod here comes from the Days of Future Past alternate future, where mutant hunting sentinels controlled North America. He is an advanced prototype of the program who tried to follow Rachel Summers into the past after her and Kate Pryde were discovered during a sabotage mission. He ended up undershooting his destination by about 20 years, where he killed Storm and forced Forge to build him a time machine, which took him to the current Marvel timeline, where he came into contact with and fought the X-Men on several occasions, eventually merging with the remains of the Master Mold and becoming Bastion. What I find so unbelievable about the character is that anyone would be scared of someone called Nimrod. In case you are not aware, Nimrod was the name of a legendary and skilled hunter from the Bible, so it is obviously implying that this Nimrod is designed to hunt mutants really efficiently. However, because Bugs Bunny would often sarcastically refer to Elmer Fudd as Nimrod in the old Looney Tunes cartoons, its meaning evolved in the general lexicon to mean an idiot. So as unbelievable as it sounds, a cartoon bunny has made me incapable of viewing this villain as threatening, because to the general public, he is calling himself an idiot.
Number 1. Ice Cream. Ice Cream has to be one of the weirdest mutant villains of all time, considering that his plan was to basically use his mutant power to turn into ice cream and then infiltrate the X-Men, and I guess I'm not really sure what his plan was here. He basically wanted revenge on the X-Men because he was jealous of how amazing their abilities were in comparison to his own. So I don't know how he thought he was gonna do that, because he's just a guy that could turn into ice cream, but yeah. Ice Cream was a very short-lived villain, not appearing specifically in X-Men, but simply as a villain to the team in issue number 1 of Obnoxio the Clown, which in all regards is also an extremely unbelievable comic that happened. In the end, his plan failed dramatically, and he got eaten by the clown who had been hired to come and celebrate Kitty Pryde's birthday. This is a strange time for everyone, but I imagine it was especially a strange time for Ice Cream. Also, I don't think he turns into a full ice cream. He also turns into a sundae, which, how is that? Is that part of it? Is he the banana as well? I am the banana.
Number 10. Thor and Hela. Starting off with an example of why the Ultimate Universe does some unnecessary stuff from time to time. Thor was forced to kill his supervillain's son to save America from civil war. But what's funny, well not funny, is that wasn't even the unnecessary part. So it begins in the aftermath of an event called Ultimatum, which we will get to much later on. Basically, Ultimate Thor ends up sacrificing his own life to save his lover, Valkyrie. While in the afterlife, in order to be reunited with and save Valkyrie, the goddess Hela makes Thor fight a whole army of undead soldiers, which he does. But then Thor asks what else he needs to do, and this goddess just starts undressing herself and demanding that Thor gives her a baby, which of course he does, and it doesn't even save Valkyrie. This comes back later with the child, Modi Thor's son, being raised by a much more villainous Loki, feeling abandoned and seeking revenge, trying to turn America into a new Asgard while wielding an Infinity Stone and forcing Thor to eventually strike down his own evil son. Number 9. Look what they did to my boy! Almost everyone loves Deadpool. Weirdly, even some moms love Deadpool. So when the gritty, realistic, mature Ultimate Universe was going to bring the character in, you'd expect it to be a match made in heaven. No! I blame this version of the character for the monstrosity we got 3 years later in 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine. The ultimate Marvel version of Deadpool was a sergeant in the military named Wade Wilson. He's grim, he's angry, he's way too serious, and he also is an incredibly racist mutant hater. Oh, he was also a cyborg with incredible strength, he retained his signature healing factor, and instead of just being disfigured, he had no skin at all. And he's missing part of his skull, so his head is instead encased in a clear plastic case for everyone to see. Deadpool leads the Reavers, who are also racist, in trying to kill prominent mutants. Thankfully, Ultimate Deadpool was taken off the board by the 616 Deadpool in Deadpool Kills Deadpool in 2013. Number 8. Hank Pym needs to chill. Hank Pym has not really ever been that great of a dude. He has multiple untreated mental disorders and crazy insecurities that have caused him to do multiple not so great things in his time in the regular universe. But of course, everything in the Ultimate Universe gets ramped up a bit. Pym got involved in a very heated argument with his wife, Janet Van Dyne, over her friendship with Captain America. In Ultimates issue number 6, things start to get physical until the Wasp shrinks down to her smaller size to get away from her husband. Unfortunately, the terribly insecure Hank cornered her and sprayed her wasp-sized self with bug spray. She hid under a desk to catch her breath after inhaling the toxic fumes, while her husband just kept on with the emotional bombardment. But he didn't stop there. He then sent an army of ants after her until he realized what he was doing to his own wife. This stuff kind of boils my blood just a little bit. The fight resulted in Janet's very near death, her hospitalization, and his expulsion from the Ultimates. Number 7. Making the Maker. The Fantastic Four in the Ultimate Universe remained relatively the same, at least in their family dynamics. Their backstory was slightly modified, but overall the four main heroes lived as you'd expect, until it all went Marvel Ultimate-y. First off, Sue Storm and Reed Richards lost a child together, but then Reed Richards proposed to Susan Storm and she rejected his proposal. Just like that, the Fantastic Four was no more, but that's not the end. What came next, really quickly I might add, was Reed going absolutely bonkers, faking his death, de-lifing his family, planning alien terror plots around the world, being trapped in the negative zone where he primed his intellect by stretching his brain and skull, and he built an army. Since he was horribly burnt by the Human Torch, Reed took to wearing a helmet and founded the Children of Tomorrow, the Dark Ultimates, and he called himself the Maker. He became an incredibly evil Reed Richards. Number 6. Cap hates France? Look, despite the name, Captain America, Steve Rogers, is very much a protector of the world, not just America. So it was really odd when in Ultimates number 12 from Mark Miller, Brian Hitch, and Paul Neary, we see the Ultimate Marvel Universe Captain America verbally wailing on France, of all places. Captain America is caught in a fight with Herr Kleiser, an old German rival. Just for better context, Nick Fury is there too. Captain America is obviously the hero though, so eventually he gets the upper hand. It was just so odd that when Kleiser was pinned by Cap and asking for surrender, well, Cap digs his shield into the dude's stomach and says, "Surrender? Surrender? You think this letter on my head stands for France?" The comment was kind of fueled by the time period it was written in, as the states were entering into a war and France refused to join them, leading to some anti-France feelings in the real world. But this World War II era dig at the country left a bad taste in pretty much everyone's mouth, especially from a character that is supposed to be much, much better than that. Number 5. Wolverine. Why are you so weird? Look, I'm gonna get into all the weirdness that is the Ultimate Universe Wolverine in a sec, but one thing that kind of immediately sticks out is how this version of Wolverine seems to repeatedly swing for ladies that are a little below his age bracket, or like a lot below. And always redheads, which I guess kind of checks out from the 616 version too. Jean Grey, Firestar, and the one we're talking about today, Mary Jane Watson. In Ultimate Spider-Man number 66, Wolverine and Peter Parker end up switching bodies after Wolverine makes some unwanted advances on the teenage Jean Grey, who psychically swapped their bodies. I don't know why she did that, but she did it. Wolverine finds some drawbacks, but apparently they pale in comparison to the perk that is the teenage Peter's girlfriend, Mary Jane. Wolverine tells MJ that he, in Peter's body, doesn't need to go to school, while also making some crude advances towards her as well. It comes off as kinda creepy and really cringy. Number 4. Wolverine. How you die. Now, on the topic of Wolverine, he himself has quite a few moments that make him kinda awesome and some that make him kinda horrible. Ultimate Wolverine is no longer feral, and he does not have the classic healing factor. Instead, he gets the survival factor, which is kind of a heck of a lot better. He can survive a heck of a lot, almost anything. S.H.I.E.L.D. chopped his body off, leaving only his head, and he breathed through his skin. They put his head in a vacuum and he went into stasis. Hulk ripped his body and threw it into another mountain range, and when Wolverine found that half, it was still fresh, no organ failure, no rot, and the blood was somehow still pumping. And he just put himself back together again with no issues. Ultimate Wolverine is unkillable by any means, no matter what you do. It was also implied that Ultimate Wolverine was the precursor of all mutants. He was sort of the first mutant in the world. So all the other mutants are basically products of Weapon X experimentation on Wolverine. On top of that, his blood could be synthesized into a substance that gives mutants insane power boosts. Marvel made Ultimate Wolverine insanely overpowered, and then they absolutely killed him in the stupidest way possible. He died because Magneto did a hand wave thingamajig, as someone on Reddit said, and apparently he destroyed every single one of Wolverine's cells while ripping out his adamantium. Number 3. Is this Game of Thrones? If you haven't noticed by some of the previous points, Marvel did a lot of unnecessary sexualizing of the Ultimate Universe. And to just push it a bit further into unnecessary odd choices made by Marvel for this universe, they included the incestuous relationship between the characters of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Somehow it actually feels worse than the one in Game of Thrones, maybe just because it was extremely shocking and the two characters never had anything even similar to this in the 616 continuity. Fans wondered whether it was really necessary for Mark Millar to pair the two characters together and questioned whether the twist added anything new to the story at all. Answer: it didn't. Probably the biggest issue with this revelation is that now the characters can't so much as look at each other without fans accusing the writers of returning to the incest plot from the Ultimate X-Men. Number 2. Blob. After the events of that ultimatum thing, which I'm so close to talking about, many heroes were taken out and or unaccounted for. One such hero would be Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp. Now, as we know, Hank Pym, Ant-Man, was kind of the worst. And though a terrible husband, he still diligently looked for his missing wife. What he found instead was the villain the Blob feasting on her remains. It's probably one of the most striking images from the whole Ultimate Universe, but it just gets stranger and somehow worse. Enraged at the sight of it, Ant-Man converted to his giant man state and picked up the Blob in his giant hand and bit Blob's head clean off and spat it on the ground to the shock and horror of his teammates. And in at number 1 is Ultimatum. Ultimatum was supposed to be how the writers finished off the Ultimate Universe stories. Obviously it didn't turn out that way, but as you can tell from previous points, writers kinda just went a little haywire with things they would do with a dying universe story. Basically, Magneto, who has been a pretty brutal villain in this universe so far, goes even farther during the mega event where stakes were way high. Basically, after Magneto gains control of the Hammer of Thor and is manipulated by none other than Dr. Doom, he messes with the magnetic pillars of the world, flipping them on their head and sending weather into a frenzy. The big event was a giant tsunami called the Ultimatum Wave that basically put New York underwater and brought a giant casualty list along with it. Bruce Banner drowns, but the Hulk lives, the Wasp gets eaten, as mentioned before, and Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch are killed off. In a bit more of a divisive move, while the X-Men are looking for their fallen teammates in the wake of the tidal wave in New York, Magneto pays a visit to Professor X and in a pretty brutal scene, snaps the professor's neck. Magneto also rips the adamantium from Wolverine's skeleton and pretty much disintegrates him like we talked about before.
Barnell Bohusk, better known as Beak. Now let's be honest, Barnell Bohusk, or Beak as he's more commonly known, didn't exactly win the genetic lottery when it came to his mutation. We're talking feathers, a beak, talons. The poor guy resembles a perpetually plucked chicken, and it's a look that's understandably made him the target of ridicule. But don't let his somewhat comical appearance fool you. Beneath that feathery exterior lies a heart of gold and a surprising wellspring of courage. Beak might not be the strongest or fastest mutant in the X-Men's roster, but he's incredibly agile, boasting enhanced senses that make him surprisingly aware of his surroundings. He can even use his unique physiology to glide through the air, a skill he's honed over time, even though he hasn't quite mastered the art of full-fledged sustained flight. What truly sets Beak apart, however, is his unwavering optimism, his infectious spirit, and his profound ability to see the good in everyone, even when they're struggling to see it in themselves. He's a living testament to the idea that true strength comes from within, a beacon of hope in a world that often judges solely on appearances. Next up is a mutant whose appearance is, shall we say, unforgettable. Glob Herman. And let me tell you, this guy is hard to miss. Glob's mutation has rendered his skin completely translucent, a jelly-like substance that offers a rather graphic window to his internal workings. You can literally see his skeleton, his organs, everything. It's definitely a unique, if somewhat disturbing look, and it's made Glob's life incredibly challenging. He's faced prejudice and discrimination from both humans and mutants, constantly judged and ostracized for his unconventional appearance. And this is key, Glob has never let the negativity and cruelty get him down. He's remarkably resilient, both physically and emotionally. His gelatinous form makes him incredibly durable, able to absorb impacts that would cripple others, and he can even detach his limbs without feeling any pain, a truly bizarre and useful ability. He's also surprisingly strong, able to hold his own in a fight. Glob Herman stands as a powerful testament to the fact that what's on the inside matters far more than outward appearances. A walking, talking, and jiggling reminder to never judge a book by its cover. Now things are about to get intense, folks. At number 8, we have a villain of truly cosmic proportions, Cassandra Nova, Professor X's evil twin sister. I know, it sounds like something straight out of a soap opera, but trust me, the reality is far more terrifying. Cassandra isn't a twin in the traditional sense. She's a Mumudrai, a concept from Shi'ar mythology that describes a parasitic spirit born alongside a physical body in the womb. Think of it like a dark psychic reflection of a person's soul, a being of pure negativity and malice. In this case, that person happened to be Charles Xavier, one of the most powerful telepaths on the planet. Cassandra formed alongside him in the womb, a parasitic entity that stealthily stole his DNA to create a physical body for herself. This twisted process granted her incredible telepathic powers mirroring Xavier's own, but unlike her brother, she has dedicated her existence to the complete and utter annihilation of mutant kind. Cassandra's not just a powerful telepath, she's a genocidal maniac responsible for the horrific Genosha massacre, an event that saw the slaughter of millions of innocent mutants on the island nation of Genosha. She orchestrated this atrocity with cold, calculated precision, solidifying her place as one of the X-Men's most dangerous and formidable foes. Cassandra Nova is a truly terrifying villain, a being of immense power and bottomless cruelty, and the X-Men have had to pull out all the stops, pushing themselves to their absolute limits to even stand a chance against her. Get ready for some girl power. At number 7, we have Irma Cuckoo, one of the Stepford Cuckoos. These ladies are clones of Emma Frost, created by the Weapon Plus program. They're all powerful telepaths, and together they form a hive mind, which basically means they share thoughts and amplify their powers. Irma and her sisters can read minds, control others, and even create illusions. They've been a vital part of the X-Men, using their powers to protect mutant kind and fight for a better future. Next up is another member of the Stepford Cuckoos, Celeste. Like her sisters, she's a powerful telepath and part of their hive mind, but Celeste is often seen as the most level-headed and mature of the group. She's a natural leader and has a strong sense of responsibility. Rounding out the Stepford Cuckoos on our list is Phoebe. She's got all the same telepathic powers as her sisters, but with a bit of a rebellious streak. Phoebe isn't afraid to challenge authority and fight for what she believes in. Now, for a truly inspiring story, we have Martha Johansson, also known as No Girl. Martha's past is incredibly tragic. She was captured by the U-Men, a group of humans who experimented on mutants. They literally removed her brain from her body. But even without a body, Martha's spirit remained strong. She retained her powerful telepathic abilities and can communicate with others, control minds, and even negate the powers of other mutants. Martha eventually joined the X-Men, proving that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, hope and resilience can prevail. She's a true inspiration and a testament to the strength of the human, or should I say, mutant spirit. At number 3, we have Forge, a mutant with an incredible knack for inventing. He can instinctively understand and build any kind of technology, from weapons to vehicles to advanced computers. He's been a valuable asset to the X-Men, creating all sorts of gadgets and devices to help them in their missions. Forge has a long and complicated history with the X-Men, especially with Storm. He even created the weapon that accidentally depowered her. But despite their rocky past, Forge has always been a loyal ally to the X-Men, using his skills to protect mutant kind. Prepare to have your mind blown. At number 2, we have Zorn, a mutant with a miniature star for a brain. This grants him some insane powers, including energy manipulation, healing, and even telepathy. Zorn was initially a prisoner who was rescued by the X-Men 12. He joined their ranks and used his powers to help them, but his story took a wild turn when he was revealed to be Magneto in disguise. However, this was eventually retconned, and Zorn was established as his own unique unique character. Talk about a confusing backstory. And finally, at the top of our list, we have Quentin Quire, also known as Kid Omega. This guy is an Omega level telepath, which basically means his powers are off the charts. He can read minds, control others, and even create incredibly realistic illusions. But what makes Quentin truly unique is his ability to create psychic constructs and manipulate reality. He can literally bend the world around him with his mind. He's one of the most powerful mutants out there, and he's definitely one to watch. Okay, I know I said top 10, but I couldn't resist adding one more. This is Surge, a mutant with the power to absorb and manipulate electricity. She can generate powerful blasts of energy, move at super speed, and even fly. Surge has had her fair share of struggles, especially when it comes to controlling her powers. But she's a natural leader and has become a role model for other young mutants. She's a reminder that even when things get tough, you can always find the strength to overcome your challenges. Alright, I promise this is the last one. Meet Sync, a mutant with the power to mimic the powers of other mutants around him. He can basically become a one-man X-Men team. Sync has been through a lot, including a mission to a dangerous place called the Vault, where time moves differently. He's also recently stepped up as a leader on the X-Men team. He's a powerful and versatile mutant with a bright future ahead of him, so we've journeyed through a whirlwind of weird, wonderful, and sometimes downright tragic mutant powers. But the question remains, where do these mutants stand in the grand scheme of power within the Marvel Universe?